When my secretary, Sarah, started avoiding my gaze, I knew something was amiss. I'm Gregory Hayes, a 45-year-old senior accountant at Apex Tech Solutions in Austin, Texas. I'd been diligently crunching numbers for the past 10 years. It wasn't the most exciting career path, but it kept my mind sharp and ensured my son's college tuition was covered. That morning, Sarah, who usually greeted me with a cheerful smile and my coffee already waiting, was unusually preoccupied with filing. She didn't look up, didn't offer her customary morning greeting, simply shuffled papers as if I were invisible. A subtle shift had occurred. I sensed it in the office atmosphere. Conversations abruptly ceasing when I approached, meeting invitations mysteriously excluding me. Most alarmingly, my access to specific financial files on the company server had been silently revoked a week earlier. I settled into my chair, launched my spreadsheets, and began reviewing the quarterly reports I'd been meticulously preparing before the arrival of Mr. Robert Johnson. He was the new Chief Financial Officer, replacing our longtime CFO, Mr. David Miller, who had suffered a heart attack and opted for early retirement. Robert boasted impressive credentials from a prestigious firm on the East Coast and exuded a confidence that commanded attention and silenced any questions. The figures simply didn't align. I had initially discovered the discrepancies 3 weeks prior. Vendor payments lacking proper documentation, revenue reported months before contracts were finalized, and a suspicious account containing millions of dollars that appeared and vanished between reporting periods. The first time I raised these concerns during a finance meeting, Robert smiled, patted my shoulder, and dismissed my concerns with a vague, "Different methods than your old ways, Gregory. Trust the process." My second attempt involved a detailed email directly to him, providing specific examples and highlighting discrepancies within spreadsheets. I received no response. My third attempt yesterday found him alone in the break room. "I need to discuss these inconsistencies," I said quietly. "The Q2 reporting is revealing." "Gregory," he interrupted, stirring his coffee deliberately. "You're part of the older generation here. I respect that. However, we're modernizing our approach. The board prioritizes growth metrics. Focus on the big picture." I hadn't slept well since that conversation. 20 years in accounting had taught me that when someone urges you to disregard details and focus solely on the overall financial picture, something's usually amiss. As I scrolled through the limited files still accessible to me, an email notification popped up on my screen. It was from Human Resources. The subject line, "Meeting Request." 11 a.m. I closed my laptop, took a sip of the coffee I'd purchased on my way to work, and began tidying my desk. I already knew what awaited me. I joined Apex Tech when it was merely a small team of 30 people in a renovated warehouse before its IPO and the Austin tech boom. Now we boasted over 300 employees, a modern downtown office, and institutional investors demanding consistent quarterly growth. My wife, Jessica, used to jest that I was married to my spreadsheets. "You find stories in numbers," she'd say. She wasn't wrong. One could discern patterns and anomalies, the moments where human fallibility seeped into supposedly objective data. That meticulous attention to detail had earned me Mr. Miller's trust. He'd called me his bullshit detector. Every company needs at least one individual who cannot be swayed or intimidated into overlooking the truth. He confided in me over drinks after we'd uncovered an attempt by the sales team to record revenue that hadn't actually been secured. I recalled my brother-in-law, Michael, Jessica's younger brother, who had chosen a career in public service with the Securities and Exchange Commission's Enforcement Division. We weren't exceptionally close, but we held mutual respect, engaging in thoughtful conversations at family gatherings about regulatory issues and prominent financial enforcement cases. Last Christmas, while others watched football, we discussed a corporate fraud case that had made headlines. "By the time we get involved," Michael had remarked, "it's typically been ongoing for months, sometimes years. Most frauds are uncovered because someone internally realizes what's happening and speaks up. Whistleblowers, I'd said. He'd corrected, individuals with a conscience and discerning eyes. Those who cannot pretend they haven't noticed. That memory faded as I checked my watch. 10:45 a.m. Almost time for my meeting with HR. Looking back, I should have seen the signs sooner. Robert had been systematically isolating me since his third week on the job. Questions I raised in meetings were dismissed. My team was gradually reassigned to different projects. My reports were increasingly simplified or buried. Then, last week, I found it. The smoking gun. While reviewing historical data, I noticed a pattern of revenue manipulation spanning the previous 2 quarters. Millions of dollars were shifted between subsidiaries, false sales were recorded, and contracts were backdated. It wasn't subtle if you knew where to look, but catastrophic if allowed to continue. I'd meticulously documented everything, made copies, and stored them securely, just in case. My phone vibrated with a text from Jessica. "How's your day going?" I didn't respond. It was better to tell her in person that evening. I closed the company financial report, locked my computer, and headed to the HR conference room. Time to face whatever was coming. "We're restructuring the finance department," stated Robert, seated beside Paula from HR. "Unfortunately, your position has been eliminated." I nodded, my expression neutral. This wasn't a surprise, but the careful wording was almost comical. Not fired, eliminated, as if I were a budget line item being crossed off. "Your institutional knowledge has been valuable," Robert continued. "We're transitioning to more automated systems, more forward-looking analytics." "I see," I replied. Paula slid a folder across the table. "This contains information regarding your severance package, continuation of benefits, and a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, you'll need to sign." I opened it and quickly scanned the first page. 6 months' salary. Reasonable. The NDA was comprehensive, specifically prohibiting me from discussing Apex Tech's financial processes, reporting methods, or proprietary practices with anyone. "Take your time reviewing it," Paula said. "We don't require an answer today." And of course, Robert added with a strained smile, "We'd appreciate discretion regarding our conversation, for the sake of team morale." I closed the folder. "I'll need to review this with my lawyer." A flicker of annoyance, perhaps concern, crossed Robert's face. He hadn't anticipated any resistance, not even this mild. "Of course," Paula smoothly interjected, "standard procedure." "In the meantime," Robert continued, "we'll need to begin the offboarding process today." 30 minutes later, security escorted me to my desk. A cardboard box for personal belongings was provided, my email access was already disabled, and my building access card was collected. A few colleagues watched from their desks, their expressions ranging from awkwardness to relief that it wasn't them. As I carefully packed my family photos into the ceramic mug my son had made in middle school, Sarah finally made eye contact. "I'm sorry, Gregory," she whispered. "This isn't right." I simply nodded. It wasn't her fault. Mark from my team paused, then offered to help me pack. "They've reassigned all your reports to the new team from Chicago," he muttered, feigning organization. "Nobody's explaining the changes in methodology." I quickly scribbled my personal email address on a sticky note and slipped it to him. "If you have any questions later." Security cleared his throat. Time to go. Walking through the lobby, past the gleaming company sign I'd helped create, a profound shift occurred within me. Not anger precisely, but something colder, clearer. For weeks, I'd wrestled with self-doubt, questioning whether I was misinterpreting the numbers, if I was simply resisting change. Now I knew they wouldn't dismiss a senior accountant due to modernization. They would dismiss someone who saw too much. In my car, I sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. I didn't pound the dashboard or curse. Instead, I retrieved my phone and the flash drive tucked in my wallet, the one containing copies of everything I'd documented. Then, I scrolled to Michael's contact information. I hadn't contacted him in months. I'd been hesitant to mix family and work. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about investors being deceived, regulations being violated, and a company I'd helped build being systematically undermined. I pressed the call button. "Michael, it's Gregory. I think we need to talk. They want you to sign this." Michael slid the severance agreement across my kitchen table, his expression grave in the dim evening light. "This NDA is exceptionally broad." Jessica poured more coffee, her movements sharp with anger. After hearing my story, she'd immediately called her brother. He'd driven straight over from his office. "6 months' salary is generous," I said, "but they're buying silence. And they know exactly what you've seen," Michael replied. He was thinner than I remembered. His government job apparently didn't allow for many regular meals. Otherwise, they wouldn't offer this much. I handed him the flash drive. "Everything I found is here. Revenue manipulation across at least 2 quarters. Phantom transactions, moving money between subsidiaries to inflate growth figures." Michael pocketed the drive but shook his head. "This is definitely concerning, but I need to be clear. If you sign that NDA and then share this information, they could sue you personally. The SEC could still investigate, but you'd be legally vulnerable." "So they get away with it?" Jessica asked, her voice rising. "Not necessarily," Michael replied, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Gregory hasn't signed anything yet, but we need to proceed cautiously." The following morning, I contacted an employment lawyer, Ms. Catherine Miller. She listened attentively to my situation, reviewed the severance agreement, and confirmed Michael's assessment. "This NDA would effectively prevent you from acting as a whistleblower," she stated. "I advise against signing it in its current form." "Can we negotiate better terms?" I asked. She offered a thin smile. "We can try." 2 days later, I received a call from Robert himself, not HR. His voice was tense. "Gregory, I understand you've consulted legal counsel to review the agreement." "Standard procedure," I echoed his earlier words. Pause. "We value your years of service and want this transition to be seamless for everyone. Perhaps we can meet to discuss your concerns." That afternoon, I found myself back in the same conference room, this time with Catherine beside me, facing Robert and the company's general counsel, a severe woman named Ms. Diana Lee. "We can increase the severance to 9 months, Robert offered. "But the confidentiality clauses remain non-negotiable." Catherine smiled politely. "My client has concerns about certain financial irregularities he observed during his employment. The current wording could be interpreted as preventing him from fulfilling his legal obligations should regulatory issues arise." Diana's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting Mr. Hayes intends to make allegations against Apex Tech?" "I'm suggesting," Catherine replied, "that my client cannot waive his legal right to report potentially unlawful activity, regardless of any agreement." The room's temperature seemed to plummet. "I think we need to be very clear," Robert said, leaning forward. "There are no irregularities or unlawful activities at Apex Tech. What we have is a former employee who perhaps misunderstood our updated accounting practices and may harbor resentment over organizational changes." He slid a new document across the table. "We're prepared to offer 12 months' salary, quite generous. But we'll need a signed statement confirming you observed no illegal activities during your employment, along with the NDA." I felt Catherine stiffen beside me. "We'll need to review this new offer," she stated, gathering her papers. In the elevator, she was direct. "They're scared. That counteroffer essentially asks you to sign a false statement, which would discredit you should you ever come forward." I realized she was exactly right, and 12 months' salary was a small price for them to pay to neutralize a potential whistleblower. As we walked through the lobby, I noticed Mark from my team hurrying toward the entrance. His eyes widened when he saw me. Instead of heading for the elevators, he veered toward the building's coffee shop. I told Catherine I'd meet her at the car. "Gregory," Mark said quietly when I caught up to him in line, "they're going through all your old files. Robert has a team working late, modifying reports you worked on." My stomach plummeted. They're covering their tracks. He nodded, pale. And they just announced an all-hands meeting tomorrow regarding exciting Q3 projections. The numbers they're showing, they're not real. We both know it. Be careful, Mark. You too. They're saying things about you, that you couldn't adapt, that you made mistakes. He grabbed his coffee and quickly left. I walked to Catherine's car, my mind racing. They weren't just concealing past fraud. They were accelerating it, emboldened by my dismissal. That night, Michael came over again. We spread printouts across my dining room table. Documents I'd secured, analysis he'd begun, and regulations potentially violated. This goes deeper than I initially thought, he said, tapping a specific spreadsheet. These patterns suggest the manipulation began before Robert's arrival. I frowned, reviewing the timeline. That doesn't make sense. Mr. Miller was meticulous, ethical to a fault. When did Mr. Miller leave, exactly? Michael asked. 4 months ago, sudden heart attack. He'd been stressed, working late, but something clicked. I pulled up another document, the audit committee meeting minutes from my files. Mr. Miller had raised concerns about pressure from the board to improve quarterly numbers just 2 weeks before his health crisis. You think he was pushed out? Jessica asked, placing 3 beers on the table. Not necessarily pushed, I said slowly. But if he was under pressure to manipulate results and refused, the stress alone could trigger health problems. Michael finished, and create an opportunity to bring in someone more compliant. I took a long drink. So Robert was hired specifically to continue or cover up fraud that was already happening. It's a theory, Michael cautioned, but look at the board changes last year. 3 new directors from investment firms specializing in tech turnarounds. They probably wanted faster growth to position for acquisition. I sifted through more documents, locating board meeting minutes. Here, they approved an executive compensation plan heavily weighted towards stock performance metrics. The entire C-suite received massive bonuses if the share price reached certain targets. Michael nodded grimly. Classic motivation. And with Mr. Miller gone, you were the last person in finance who might notice an object. For hours, we pieced together the bigger picture. This wasn't just Robert. It was systemic, involving board members and possibly other executives. The scope was staggering. Inflated revenues, hidden expenses, manipulated projections designed to artificially boost the stock price before a rumored acquisition. The public filing next week, I realized. If they report these falsified Q3 numbers, they're committing securities fraud in broad daylight and potentially harming thousands of investors, Michael added. Around midnight, Catherine called with news. Apex Tech's counsel reached out. They're withdrawing the severance offer entirely, claiming evidence of potential misconduct on your part. My laughter was hollow. What misconduct? They're alleging you took confidential documents, and they're threatening to pursue all available legal remedies unless you return all company property immediately. They know, Jessica said after I hung up. They know you have evidence, which means we've struck a nerve. Michael gathered the papers into a neat stack. Gregory, this has escalated beyond wrongful termination. The SEC needs to launch a formal investigation. What does that mean for me? I asked. You become an official whistleblower. There are protections, but it's still a challenging path. These cases can take years. The company will likely attack your credibility, your work history, anything they can find. Jessica took my hand. Can they hurt him legally? She asked. If everything you've shown me is accurate, you've done nothing wrong. But corporate defendants have resources, lawyers, and the motivation to fight aggressively. I thought about Apex Tech, the company I'd dedicated a decade to. About Mr. Miller, who might have been pushed into a health crisis for upholding his ethics. About Mark and others still there, forced to participate in fraud or risk their jobs. I'll need to consider this, I said. Michael nodded, understanding that the protection afforded to whistleblowers is strongest when they act before they are terminated or targeted. The timing isn't ideal, but the evidence is compelling. After he left, Jessica and I sat in silence. I could just walk away, I finally said. Find another job. Let someone else handle it. She studied my face. Could you really? Sleep at night, knowing what you know? I already knew the answer. I'd never been able to ignore problems, to pretend numbers added up when they didn't. It was both my greatest strength and what had cost me my job. No, I admitted, I couldn't. The SEC moved faster than I anticipated. Once Michael officially presented the case to his superiors, things progressed rapidly. I spent 2 days in closed-door meetings at the SEC offices, guiding investigators through everything I'd discovered. They were particularly interested in the timeline, how the manipulation had evolved, how Robert had systematically excluded me from financial oversight, and the connection to executive compensation tied to stock performance. The company's Q3 filing is scheduled for Monday, said Helen Chen, the lead investigator. Based on what you've provided, we have grounds to act before then. You can stop the filing. I asked. Better, she replied. We can catch them in the act. What followed was a meticulously planned operation. The SEC would not alert Apex Tech about the investigation. Instead, they would monitor the final preparation of the fraudulent filing. They needed to catch the executives knowingly submitting false financial statements. My role was to remain completely silent. No contact with former colleagues, no social media, nothing that might alert them. Meanwhile, Catherine filed a wrongful termination claim, creating a diversion. Apex Tech's legal team would focus on that battle while remaining unaware of the larger investigation brewing behind the scenes. On Friday, 3 days before the scheduled filing, Mark texted me from a new number. CFO called an emergency Saturday meeting for the finance team. Final review before Monday's filing. They're rushing it. I forwarded this to Michael without responding to Mark. We couldn't risk any leaks. Saturday morning brought unexpected news. Michael called at dawn. Mr. Miller agreed to talk, he said, excitement evident in his usually professional demeanor. Mr. Miller, my old boss. We approached him confidentially yesterday. He initially refused, but after hearing the extent of what we've uncovered, he changed his mind. This was the breakthrough we needed. Mr. Miller had been present before, during, and immediately after the fraud began. He could testify about the pressure he'd received, identify those who pushed for the accounting manipulations, and corroborate my findings. By Saturday afternoon, Mr. Miller had given a sworn statement to the SEC. The pieces were falling into place faster than any of us had anticipated. Sunday night, I barely slept. The filing was scheduled for 8:00 a.m. Monday. Jessica found me at the kitchen table at 5:00 a.m., staring at my phone. Whatever happens, she said, squeezing my shoulder, you did the right thing. Michael texted at 6:30 a.m., teams in position, stay by your phone. At 7:15 a.m., filing drafted and approved internally. We have copies. At 8:02 a.m., filing submitted to SEC. Green light. At 8:45 a.m., financial news channels began reporting breaking news. SEC enforcement officials had raided Apex Tech headquarters with search warrants. By 9:30 a.m., trading of Apex Tech stock was halted. At 10:15 a.m., camera crews captured Robert Johnson being escorted from the building, along with the CEO and 2 other executives. Michael called at noon. It's done. They filed the fraudulent statements this morning despite having been warned by Mr. Miller months ago about the accounting issues. We have emails proving they knew the numbers were false, and we found evidence they were planning to announce an acquisition next week, timed perfectly to cash in their stock options at the inflated price. I felt strangely empty watching the news coverage. The company I'd dedicated a decade to was now a major scandal. Former colleagues faced uncertainty. The stock would plummet, and reputations would be ruined. Was there any other way this could have ended? I asked Michael. No, he replied firmly. The fraud would have continued until it collapsed under its own weight and hurt far more people in the process. My phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. It was Mark. "They're saying you were right all along about everything." I didn't reply. I didn't need validation anymore. The numbers had spoken for themselves. 4 months after that Monday morning raid, I sat in a federal courthouse, listening as Robert Johnson pleaded guilty to securities fraud, conspiracy, and making false statements to investors. The CEO and 2 board members had already entered similar pleas the previous week. I was there as an observer, not a witness. The evidence was so overwhelming that the case never went to trial. Mr. Miller sat beside me, still looking frail, but with clear eyes. "I should have fought harder," he said quietly as Robert was led away. Instead, I let them push me out when my heart gave warning signs. "You did fight," I reminded him. "You documented everything," which helped build the case. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom. The defendants exploited their positions of trust, manipulated financial statements, and deliberately misled investors for personal gain. This court takes a particularly dim view of executives who pressure subordinates to participate in fraudulent schemes and then terminate those who refuse to comply. Afterwards, outside on the courthouse steps, a reporter recognized me. "Mr. Hayes, you were the whistleblower who exposed the Apex Tech fraud." Any comment on today's guilty pleas? I shook my head and continued walking. This wasn't about publicity or vindication. That evening, I received an email from Apex Tech's new interim CEO, a respected financial restructuring specialist brought in by the remaining board members. "The board would like to extend a formal apology for your termination and the subsequent attempts to discredit you. Your commitment to financial integrity ultimately saved this company from even greater harm. We would welcome a conversation about your potential return in a senior oversight capacity as we rebuild trust with investors and employees." I showed the email to Jessica. "Are you considering it?" she asked. I closed my laptop. No, some bridges, once burned, shouldn't be rebuilt. The company that had prioritized growth over ethics, that had punished truth-telling and rewarded deception, wasn't one I wanted to help revive, even under new management. 6 months after the courthouse, I sat on our back deck, watching autumn leaves fall. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Final settlement announced. $62 million penalty. Defrauded investors receiving 94 cents on the dollar. Not bad. I set the phone down and returned to the papers spread before me. A business plan for a financial compliance consulting firm. After the Apex Tech case made headlines, I'd received calls from companies wanting to strengthen their internal controls, from law firms needing expert witnesses, and from business schools requesting guest lectures. It turned out there was a market for people who understood both the mechanics of financial fraud and the courage to stand against it. "Walter's on the phone," Jessica called from inside. "Says he has news." Mr. Miller had been consulting with the Department of Justice on strengthening whistleblower protections. His experience, both the health toll and the courage to eventually come forward, had made him an effective advocate. "They're adopting our recommendations," he told me, his voice stronger than I'd heard in years. "New protections, a better reward structure, clearer reporting channels. It should make it easier for the next person who spots something wrong." "That's good," I said, meaning it. "That's really good." After we hung up, I made a few final notes on my business plan. The whistleblower award I'd received had provided us with financial security, but this new venture wasn't about money. It was about making integrity the standard, not the exception. Jessica brought out coffee, sitting beside me. "You never did tell me," she said, "when exactly you knew you were going to report them." I thought about it. The moment they fired me. Not because I was angry, but because that's when I knew for certain I was right. They wouldn't have gone to that much trouble otherwise. She nodded. "Some people mistake being quiet for being weak." "Their mistake," I said, watching another leaf drift down. "Not mine."